CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, is accusing the National Enquirer and its publisher of extortion and blackmail.
It could be the event of the season, a wedding for one of the richest men in the world, but it's also stoking controversy as preparations are underway in Venice.
What happens when the quietest voice in a billionaire dynasty finally decides to speak? Preston Bezos, son of the world-shaping Jeff Bezos, has shattered years of silence with a message that is shaking the family empire to its core. In just a few words, he pulled back the curtain on power, legacy, and the price of ambition. This isn't another tabloid headline. It's a raw glimpse into what really breaks behind the walls of unimaginable wealth. Whispers turn into a worldwide conversation. People are questioning the myth of Bezos like never before.
Now to a CNN exclusive interview with our very own Chloe Melas. In a wide-ranging interview, Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, is...
What did Preston reveal, and why now? Stay with us, because the truth he shared could change everything you thought you knew. The silence breaks. For decades, Preston Bezos was nothing more than a quiet silhouette behind the world's richest man.
This is Jeff Bezos. He is the richest person in the world.
A son carefully shielded from headlines and hungry cameras, a name the public barely even whispered. He had no scandals, no interviews, no slip-ups, almost no trace at all except a few blurred photos from school or family events. But every fortress has cracks, and in Preston's case, a single grainy, unfiltered video brought his silence crashing down. The world was stunned as he appeared on screen, raw and unguarded, and spoke the words no one expected. It's time to tell the truth. That moment struck like lightning through the Bezos empire, rattling decades of carefully controlled image building, shaking the legend of a man who had defined success for an entire generation. What pain could push a son to break the code of absolute silence that had protected him since birth? Preston had watched a trillion-dollar dynasty rise around him, built by a father praised as visionary, unstoppable, untouchable, and yet saw fractures no one else dared to see. He witnessed the family torn by divorce, the public blinded by the myth of power, and felt the burden of a name that was never truly his to own. And now, with one soft but unstoppable voice, he stepped out of the shadows, exposing the hidden cost of an empire that demanded loyalty but forgot about love. Preston's words were few, but they were enough to turn the world's most polished success story into something far more fragile: a father's legacy, suddenly questioned by the one person who mattered most. The ghost son. For nearly 20 years, Preston Bezos lived in a world that both belonged to him and rejected him at the same time. A billionaire's child so carefully hidden that people questioned if he even existed beyond a name on paper. He was the ghost son, a boy raised behind walls built not only of wealth, but of ironclad silence, where public curiosity was deflected with polite refusals and even the press learned to give up. While Jeff Bezos turned Amazon into a cultural force and a financial giant,
world's richest man, Jeff Bezos founded Amazon in a Washington garage.
Preston stayed off the grid. No interviews, no social posts, no tabloid fuel, nothing to hint at what went on behind his calm, private eyes. People could only wonder what it felt like to live in the echo of a man worshipped by the entire business world. To grow up with every move measured against the scale of rockets, record profits, and the legacy of a father who practically reinvented the modern age. Some friends said he was thoughtful, reserved, never hungry for attention, and perhaps even suspicious of it. But silence is never empty, and Preston's was anything but passive. Inside, questions must have raged. How does a son find a true self when the father's name is worth more than the GDP of a nation? How do you build an identity when your choices are forever overshadowed by someone else's dreams? That mystery surrounded Preston like a second skin, letting him disappear from public life while quietly carrying every wound and every conflict inside. And it was that buried storm, hidden for years, that made his sudden words feel like a thunderclap across the world. The empire's first crack.
Amazon founder Jeff Bezos will likely still be the world's richest man after his divorce from his wife Mackenzie.
When Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos announced their divorce in 2019, the world reeled from the shock, but few considered what it meant for their children, especially Preston. The split of one of the planet's most powerful couples became front-page news overnight, dissected, analyzed, spun into a billion-dollar spectacle. Yet behind the headlines, something far more human was breaking. Preston was 19 then, old enough to see every messy truth with grown-up eyes, but young enough to still carry the illusions a son builds around a father. The carefully controlled walls that had protected the Bezos family shattered in the glare of leaked messages and tabloid photos, exposing what had always been hidden. Jeff's affair with Lauren Sanchez turned a clean, polite divorce into a global drama, and while the public obsessed over yacht vacations and secret texts, Preston faced a much deeper wound: the sudden collapse of everything he thought his family stood for. Trust, respect, loyalty, all the values he had been taught, felt upended. And worse, he was expected to stay silent, to never publicly question what the world had decided was none of his business. But Preston watched, he listened, and each new rumor twisted the knife a little deeper. The divorce, more than any stock trade or media scandal, was the first crack in the empire as he saw it. Not because of money, but because of what it revealed: that even the mightiest man on earth could let power blind him to what truly mattered. Preston buried those feelings for years, but the crack had started, and there would be no repairing it. The father's shadow. Living in the orbit of Jeff Bezos meant existing under a light so bright it could burn through any sense of normal life. Preston was never given a chance to grow up without that glare, never allowed to just be a son instead of the heir to an unimaginable fortune. Every lesson, every moment, was measured against a father whose name meant genius, dominance, and unstoppable ambition. There were no small dreams in that house, only towering goals and constant reminders of the empire his father had built from nothing. On paper, it seemed inspiring, but for Preston, it was suffocating. How do you chart your own course when the world expects you to become the next version of a legend? How do you speak your mind when every word could be twisted against the family, against the myth? Preston carried that weight alone, refusing to play the part of a spoiled rich kid or hungry celebrity child. There were no brand launches, no social media rants, no desperate claims to fame. But hiding in his father's shadow came at a cost. The expectations were too heavy, the silence too loud, and the distance from his own identity grew deeper every day. Behind closed doors, friends said Preston quietly challenged some of Jeff's choices, but outside, he was always respectful, always controlled. Yet the frustration simmered, and the sense of being swallowed by a legacy he didn't choose only grew. Someday, something had to give, because even the most disciplined shadows eventually step into the light, if only to breathe. The quiet observer. For years after the divorce, Preston Bezos kept himself hidden in a fortress of polite silence. While the media devoured every move Jeff made with Lauren Sanchez, Preston refused to be drawn into the drama. He appeared in no family photo ops, issued no statements, and left no social trail for the gossip press to dissect. Yet insiders say he was paying closer attention than anyone realized. Behind those calm eyes, he was watching every decision, every pivot, every moment where his father's values seemed to slip. Friends quietly noted that Preston had questions, deep and uncomfortable ones, about whether power had changed Jeff, about whether the mission had become bigger than the man. His observations were never loud, but they were sharp, almost surgical in their honesty. At dinners, he would ask why philanthropy seemed more like a headline than a conviction, why legacy was measured in rockets instead of relationships. These questions made Jeff uncomfortable, but Preston did not push too hard, not then. Instead, he stored up those doubts, letting them age and sharpen inside him. It was a quiet rebellion, invisible to the public but powerful in the private world of a father and son who could barely speak the same emotional language anymore. Preston had learned to observe, to listen, to wait for the right moment to speak. And when he finally did, the shock came not just from what he said, but from how long he had carried the truth in silence, a truth that would not only shake the empire, but expose the wounds no money could ever heal, the rings of power moment. The first true glimpse of Preston's hidden voice slipped out in 2022, almost by accident, at a place no one expected, the glittering UK premiere of Amazon's mega-budget show, The Rings of Power. Jeff Bezos took the stage with cameras flashing, smiling like the king of culture, celebrating a project meant to cement Amazon's entertainment legacy. But beneath the polished speeches was a single line that broke through, a quote Jeff revealed from Preston himself. "Dad, please don't mess this up." The audience laughed, treating it as a harmless joke, but those who truly knew Preston saw something different. This was no silly one-liner. Preston had loved Tolkien's stories since childhood, respected their lessons of humility, courage, and resisting the temptation of power. For him, Tolkien's work was sacred, a symbol of meaning beyond money. To hear that same legend turned into corporate spectacle felt like a final insult. His words carried a subtle but powerful warning, a plea not to destroy something real for the sake of profit. Friends close to the family said Preston was deadly serious, and that line was more than a critique of a TV show. It was a warning shot about his father's shifting priorities. It revealed a young man who feared that the same hunger consuming his father's business choices was also eating away at their family's soul. One moment, one small sentence, but it exposed years of hidden tension and signaled to the world that Preston was no longer willing to keep his questions locked away. The weight of a name. Being a Bezos came with privileges beyond imagination, but for Preston, it also carried a silent, crushing burden. From the moment he was old enough to understand, he knew that the world expected something from him, to become a new Jeff Bezos, to lead, to conquer, to innovate. There was never room for doubt or small dreams. Every teacher, every friend, every distant relative treated him like royalty, assuming his path was already written in gold. But what if he didn't want it? What if he wanted to live without cameras, without the chains of power and reputation? Those questions haunted him through his teenage years, building a quiet resentment for a life he never chose. Even as Jeff built rockets to colonize the stars and turned Amazon into an empire, Preston felt himself disappearing behind the myth. The name Bezos had grown into something too big to escape, swallowing everything in its orbit. Friends say Preston struggled to balance gratitude for his privileges with a deep frustration at losing control of his own story. Whenever he tried to imagine a normal life, the world refused to let him. And maybe that is why, when he finally broke his silence, his voice carried so much power. It was not just the voice of a billionaire's son, it was the voice of someone who had been denied the simple right to define himself. For Preston, breaking free of the Bezos legend meant finally telling his own truth, no matter what it cost. The hidden resentment. While the world saw Preston Bezos as a quiet, obedient heir, those closest to him knew something darker had been building behind that polite silence. It was resentment. Slow, quiet, and relentless, growing year by year as he watched his father command the universe while their family crumbled. The divorce had been the first deep wound, but what came after hurt even more. Seeing Jeff move on so publicly, so quickly, with Lauren Sanchez, flaunting their love on yachts and red carpets, while the children were left to process the broken pieces in private. Preston, reserved by nature, refused to lash out or speak to tabloids, but the disappointment was there, sitting like a stone in his chest. The man the world called brilliant and visionary seemed to Preston reckless and distracted, losing sight of the simple values they once shared as a family. And every time he saw his father's name praised, that stone grew heavier. Some friends said Preston felt abandoned, as though the empire had replaced the family itself. As he got older, he began to question what any of this power was really for, and why no one dared to say out loud how deeply the Bezos household had changed. It was a resentment sharpened by years of watching, listening, and waiting for a moment to be heard. And when he finally spoke, even in a few shaky words, the bitterness rang clear. The voice of a son who had held back too long, finally demanding to be seen. The video that shook the empire. It was just under 2 minutes long, shaky and badly lit, almost easy to dismiss if you didn't listen closely. But those who watched it, and there were millions within hours, knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Preston Bezos, silent for so many years, appeared to speak straight from the heart, with no script, no filters, and no handlers. His tone was calm, but the words were razor-sharp. "It's time to tell the truth." That short sentence tore through the carefully protected image of Jeff Bezos like a blade, hinting at wounds and betrayals no money could hide. The video spread with lightning speed, replayed, dissected, analyzed from every angle. Was it really Preston? Was it a deep fake? Even without confirmation, its emotional force was impossible to ignore. There was no rage in his voice, no dramatics, just a raw honesty that felt heavier than any scandal headline. Those who knew Preston best said it sounded exactly like him, measured, wounded, tired of being silent. Within hours, journalists and insiders began scrambling for answers, trying to piece together what had finally broken him open. One line went viral almost instantly. "Silence becomes guilt when you know better." It was a direct shot at everything the Bezos name had come to stand for, a legacy built on disruption, but now threatened by its own neglected truths. Whether real or not, the clip forced the world to ask, if the quietest Bezos had spoken, what did he know that the rest of us never saw? The family torn apart. As the video continued to ripple across every social feed and news network, the fallout inside the Bezos family was immediate and intense. Rumors spread that Jeff was blindsided, seeing his son's words for the first time on a staffer's phone, his expression reportedly going pale as the clip played. Mackenzie Scott, who had kept her distance since the divorce, was said to have left a philanthropic event early after hearing the news. Even those closest to Preston could barely process what had happened. The silent child had finally spoken, and he hadn't held back. For a family built on absolute image control, this was the ultimate breach, an unfiltered look at pain that had been buried for years. Preston's message seemed to target not only his father's mistakes, but the entire myth of their perfect, untouchable dynasty. And while outsiders debated whether the video was authentic, the Bezos inner circle faced a deeper question. If Preston was willing to break ranks, what other truths might come next? That fear settled over the family like a heavy fog, turning every quiet moment into an interrogation. Was this just an outburst? Or was Preston ready to tear down the whole illusion? His words had already broken through to the public, turning the spotlight onto the raw human damage behind one of the world's most powerful legacies. In that moment, the Bezos empire felt more fragile than ever, not because of a financial threat, but because the one person they trusted to stay silent had finally found his voice. The legacy in question. In the days after the video emerged, the conversation around Jeff Bezos changed in ways no scandal or corporate controversy ever had. People had grown used to hearing about lawsuits, labor strikes, billion-dollar divorces, even affairs, but a son challenging his father's entire legacy? That was different. Suddenly, Jeff was no longer just the fearless innovator who reshaped global commerce. He was a father under fire from within his own bloodline. Preston's words, though brief, were like an earthquake, shifting public focus from business triumphs to personal failures. Even those who admired Jeff began to wonder how a man who built an empire could have missed what was happening inside his own home. The myth of perfect, unstoppable success started to fracture. Commentators on social media shared stories about their own strained families, saying they finally saw Jeff not as a godlike CEO, but as a flawed human who might have lost his way. Preston's line, "Legacy isn't what you build, it's what you leave behind," hit especially hard, echoing through headlines and think pieces. It forced people to question whether Jeff's decades of triumph were worth it if the cost was alienating the very family he claimed to protect. For the first time, the legend of Jeff Bezos seemed vulnerable, exposed not by a competitor or critic, but by the quiet voice of the son he could no longer control. And that one voice was enough to make the entire world look at him differently. The public responds. As Preston's quiet rebellion spread, the public reaction became a story of its own. Millions of people who had never dared to question Jeff Bezos suddenly found themselves relating to a billionaire's son in a way no one expected. Social feeds flooded with sympathy for Preston, praising his courage to speak up after years of carrying the weight of a fractured family. Comments poured in from around the world, from those who had lived through their parents' divorces, who had seen power tear relationships apart, who knew that money could never fix a wounded heart. One viral post simply read, "Even billionaires can break their kids." That sentiment resonated far beyond gossip or tabloid headlines, cutting to something raw and universal about families and pain. Meanwhile, others debated whether Preston had done the right thing, wondering if going public would only deepen the rift. But most agreed on one point. This wasn't about greed or inheritance. It was about the human cost of building an empire, a reminder that legacy cannot survive on money alone. Preston, once a silent shadow, had become a mirror for millions of people who had felt voiceless in their own families, and that alone made him a powerful figure overnight. His short, unpolished video had sparked a conversation deeper than any corporate scandal could ever hope to reach. And whether Jeff Bezos liked it or not, that conversation had only just begun, rewriting the family's story in the eyes of the world. The empire shaken. Inside Amazon, the impact of Preston's words created ripples no boardroom was prepared to handle. Executives scrambled to manage the fallout, worried less about business stability and more about the personal fracture laid bare for the entire world. There were hushed emergency meetings, worried questions about shareholder confidence, but beyond the corporate spin, there was a raw, deeply personal truth that could not be papered over. One of Jeff Bezos' own children had challenged the story of his greatness. Employees whispered that if Preston felt bold enough to speak, maybe others close to Jeff would follow, revealing more cracks in the carefully polished Bezos legacy. For a company built on loyalty and iron-fisted culture, the idea of the founder's own son defying him felt like a thunderbolt. Even those who had worked with Jeff for decades began to wonder how a man who could lead a trillion-dollar empire could lose sight of his own family's heart. The myth of Bezos had always been that he was unstoppable, a visionary who could fix or build anything. But now, the illusion wavered. And though there was no threat to the Amazon stock price, there was a threat to something far more delicate: respect. Preston's message was bigger than a family squabble. It had shaken the very foundation of what Jeff Bezos represented to the world. In one moment, a father's image of invincibility was replaced by the truth of a son who had dared to see him, flaws and all, and had found him wanting. A legacy rewritten. In the weeks after Preston's video, the entire conversation around the Bezos name felt transformed. People no longer spoke only about rockets, record-breaking profits, or bold acquisitions. They talked instead about fatherhood, values, and the real cost of power. Preston had done in 2 minutes what no rival, no journalist, no critic had ever managed. He made the world see Jeff Bezos as painfully human. The Sun's quiet honesty stripped away the billionaire mystique and replaced it with something raw and relatable. The heartbreak of a fractured family, the burden of disappointment, the wounds left when a legacy forgets its roots. Preston's words became a symbol, repeated across social media and talk shows. Legacy isn't what you build, it's what you leave behind. That single thought began to haunt Jeff's image, forcing people to look beyond the gleaming success to ask what truly endures. Even supporters of Jeff felt shaken, wondering if his unstoppable ambition had cost him more than money could ever measure. And as the weeks turned into months, Preston did not issue another statement, did not appear in interviews, choosing instead to let the silence speak for itself. But that silence, after the video, felt powerful rather than passive. The voice of someone who had finally told his truth and stepped back, letting the world decide what it meant. In that silence, the Bezos myth was changed forever, no longer flawless, but undeniably real. The quiet aftermath. As the public's frenzy faded and the news cycle moved on, the Bezos family was left to pick up the pieces in private. No new statements came from Jeff, no clarifications from Mackenzie, and no follow-up from Preston. It was as if the family chose to retreat, letting the dust settle while the world speculated on what might happen next. Insiders whispered about awkward family meetings, of Jeff trying to rebuild bridges with a son who had become the unexpected voice of reason in a household obsessed with triumph. For Preston, the release of his few simple words seemed to free him from a prison of silence, giving him permission to be more than just a billionaire's shadow. Those who knew him said he seemed lighter, calmer, as if finally seen after years of invisibility. Yet the wound was not magically healed. Legacies do not mend overnight, especially when they have been built on layers of unspoken hurt. The quiet aftermath left questions still lingering. Would Preston forgive? Would Jeff listen? Could a family so thoroughly fractured ever truly reconcile? But one truth had settled deep into the world's memory. The myth of Bezos had been cracked open, permanently reshaped by a son who dared to speak. And in that crack, people saw themselves. The pain of children, the pride of fathers, the failures that power cannot hide. Preston's voice reminded the world that even giants can fall silent, and that sometimes it takes only a whisper to change everything. In the end, Preston's quiet words did what no scandal or rival could achieve. They made the world look past the billionaire headlines and see the human cost. This wasn't about empires, stock prices, or rockets. It was about a son reclaiming his right to tell the truth. Sometimes, the most powerful voices aren't the loudest, but the ones that have waited in silence the longest. The Bezos legacy, once bulletproof, now feels fragile in a way that makes it real. Maybe that's how true change begins, when one voice dares to break the myth. And perhaps Preston's courage will remind us all to question what kind of legacy we leave behind. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious and never be afraid to speak your truth.